Hi, I'm Ann Oliva from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
And I'm Marc Dones from the National Innovation Service.
Today, we're going to have a conversation about decision making and why and how communities and organizations should implement intentional, equity-based decision making practices as they plan their homelessness response to COVID-19. But let's start with a few facts. Black people account for 40% of those experiencing homelessness, but only 13% of the overall US population. And Latinx people account for 22% of those experiencing homelessness, but only 18% of the population. Black people are dying of COVID-19 at 2.4 times the rate of white people. Unemployment in May, while still very high overall, fell among white workers, but kept rising among Black and Latinx workers. And American Indian Alaska Native folks are also disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. In Arizona, they make up 18% of COVID deaths, while being only 4% of the population. And in New Mexico, they make up 57% of the cases, while only being 9% of the population. So now that we have some data in front of us, let's start with what I hope is a fairly simple question. Marc, can you tell us why NIS developed this guide?
Yeah, we developed the guide because our systems are pretty racist. That's the pretty simple response. The equity-based decision-making framework is a guide to help communities, particularly leaders within government, philanthropy, and the nonprofit arena, dismantle that structural racism. White dominant culture has dictated all of our norms. And in order to reimagine our work as the vehicle to pursue racial justice, we need to take apart the oppressive processes that guide our systems today. This framework offers insights into what new methods might look like and how to approach designing them. It also helps folks think about what it would mean to step into an entirely different pattern of decision making. And Anne, I'm curious if you can talk to us a little bit about just why that's so important for this project.
Yeah, I know that you and I both know what it's like to be sitting at the table when big decisions are being made. And I certainly know what it's like to be the only Latina at that table or the only woman in the room. And in those situations, it can be really hard to break through if you want to create change or do something different that doesn't align with the culture in which you work. In my case, that culture for a long time was government. And dismantling structural racism within government really requires reevaluating and redesigning government processes all along the way. So when I think about my own roles and decision-making process in the leadership positions that I've held, I wish that I could have had something to help me navigate those really complex situations, or something that we could have used to set ground rules on how decisions should be made. I know, and everybody in the country knows, that I stumbled sometimes on that decision-making process. And it wasn't until I started working with young people through the National Youth Forum that I fundamentally changed the way that I viewed my own work and deliberately leaned into equity-based decision-making. So when I saw this guide through some of our work together at the community level, I knew that it could help our field lean into racial justice and equity in the way that we need to. So I know about the guide, but the world doesn't yet know. So can you tell folks a little bit about what's in the guide?
Yeah. This framework is broken up into three main categories: policy and strategy, business operations, and hiring operations. The policy and strategy section includes recommendations for making policymaking accessible to members of the community. I think, and we have heard many, many, many times from lots of people that a policy engagement tool or a way that a decision is being made is like fundamentally inaccessible. And that's a problem with the process, not the people. And so this section really focuses on how we can engage the community, how we can use the role of data and analysis in informing that work, and how we can communicate clearly with other members of the community who need to be involved, and the critical need to create ongoing feedback and accountability loops between implementation and evaluation. Under business operations, we outlined the best practices for strengthening or implementing participatory budgeting, some basic components for developing RFPs that are accessible, tips for contractor selection, data and performance management to implement in the pursuit of racial justice, and we also outlined recommendations for public communication and accountability. The final section covers hiring operations. In pursuing racial justice and dismantling structural racism, it's critical that we continue to look deeply at who is doing the work. In this section, we offer insights on equitable headcount planning, recruitment strategies, multi-stage or competency-based selection processes, and implementing diverse hiring panels with collective input opportunities to ensure equitable and diverse candidate pools. And that's the framework in a nutshell. We're also currently working on a tool that will complement the framework and help folks in communities assess their existing practices and identify where they might be improved. And Ann, I'm curious if you could give us an example about how you've used the equity-based decision-making framework in the work that you've done so far.
Yeah, I have definitely had the opportunity to work with you all in the implementation of this particular framework at the community level, and have taken those same practices and implemented them in other communities where I've been working over the last couple of years. But the example I actually want to use today for the purposes of this video is about the partnership for this project. We brought together a lot of smart and influential organizations and experts, but that group is predominantly white. We recognized that going into the partnership, but also deliberately made choices to help us lean into a racial justice and equity approach. So the framework itself reflects these values. We have leaders of color in the project or funding the project talking about racial justice and equity, and we also have powerful co-conspirators doing the same. We reach different audiences with the same message. Products related to the framework all have a racial justice and equity component. So that's why we're developing and advancing things like serving highly impacted communities first, including people experiencing homelessness, involving people with lived expertise in decision-making and program design, using data and mapping technology to serve historically marginalized neighborhoods, encouraging local governments to partner with organizations that maybe haven't received funding before, but could improve access to hardest hit populations, including Black, Latinx, and Native households. And implementing data collection so that we're tracking progress on outcomes by race and ethnicity, and making mid-course corrections when we need to. But one of the most deliberate ways we are aligning to the equity-based decision-making guidance is with the briefs on historically marginalized communities. So can you tell us why you structured that process to get to those briefs in the way that you did, and tell us a little bit about how it's going?
Sure. So we know, as you pointed out, that COVID is impacting certain communities more than it is impacting others. And at the beginning of this project, we realized that we needed to specifically respond to the needs of those communities. And we also realized what we already know, right? That being proximate to the problem means being proximate to the solution. And so in order to develop the right strategies, NIS partnered with community organizers from around the country to convene 11 virtual focus groups with folks who are recently or currently experiencing homelessness, and also from historically marginalized communities like Native folks or folks with incarceration histories or Black folks, et cetera, all to ask folks, tell us what you need, right? Tell us what's happening in your community so that we're not just making it up. And I think that one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that oftentimes when we come together around these tables of influential people, at the end of the day, we're kind of still making it up. And only by engaging directly with the people who are most impacted are we able to really root what we're saying in a reality and a context that allows people to be maximally responsive. So the briefs that you mentioned will be constructed in a way to help ESG administrators and other local officials better allocate resources to these same historically marginalized groups. And I just want to highlight, right, that centering community is really the only way to redesign towards equity and get better outcomes. And that often means that we have to engage and reallocate our time and engage from the top. Centering community is the only way to redesign toward equity and better outcomes. And what that means is that we often have to engage differently and allocate our time differently in order to do that better. And to the points that you raised about the partnership leadership being very white, we realized that early on, and so we engaged with a different group of people in order to craft these briefs. We pulled together organizers and service providers and community leaders from marginalized communities across the country to help us shape the outreach plan, help us create the questions that we were going to ask. And I want to highlight that we did all that in a matter of weeks. And what that should say, right, is that it is always possible to move quickly while adding voices that have not historically been at the table, right, if we are thoughtful and deliberate about it. And so the last question I have for you, Ann, is just, can you tell me what you think is the biggest takeaway for folks from this video?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And to the point, the last point that you just made, I hope that our local and national leaders commit to keep learning and listening and being led by those who are closest to these problems that we're trying to solve. And I hope that our partners at all levels of homelessness services really hold on to the idea that funding, hiring, priority setting, and operations decisions can all be transformed to build a new reality for our homeless services systems. Marc, I want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Always.